geography of higher education in conversation with. We have been lucky enough today to have with us Supriya Sharma. Dr. Supriya Sharma, thank you very much for being with us. I just wanted to open the discussion saying 4 keywords. They are capital, incubation, insights, and everything, which is a beautiful name for your entrepreneurship center, Supriya, the CIIE. So thanks again for being with us. This series of webinars organized in cooperation with ERIA. And so I give the floor to Giulia, Imon, and Marsan.
Thank you very much, Raffaele. You're already starting introducing our speaker, and I'm going to continue this introduction. Thank you for all participants for being with us. I see that many people are already still connecting, but please just remind to keep your microphone muted throughout the entire duration of the webinar. And also a special thanks goes to Supriya for being with us today. Supriya Sharma, Dr. Supriya Sharma, she works at CIIE.co, which is India's leading entrepreneurship center at the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. Supriya likes to connect academia to practice, and on the side of practice, she's enabling the creation of tools and toolkits to aid entrepreneur skillings and decision-making. She works on a number of topics, including entrepreneurial cognition and learning, people strategy, organizational design and incubation, as well as vertical topics such as agri-tech, financial inclusions, insurance technologies, and civic technology. She publishes in leading international journals and participates regularly in international platforms and conferences. And she also teaches courses in entrepreneurship and organizational behavior. And Supriya is a fellow of the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, and an alumni of the International Visitor Leadership Program in the US. We can immediately start with the first question of today. And I would ask Supriya to give us an overview of the development of the Indian startup ecosystem over the last decades, and to tell us a little bit how higher education institutions, in particular engineering schools, played a fundamental role in its development. Over to you, Supriya.
Thanks, Julia. Thanks, Rafael and the team here. I'm quite thrilled to be a part of this conversation. I've been quite looking forward to this chat as well the last couple of weeks. To get into your question, Julia, maybe I could begin with just giving the group here a sense of the size and perhaps the complexity of what we call the Indian startup ecosystem. And then we could use this anchor to sort of go back into history and look at its evolution. In 2020 and the latest estimates that we could perhaps pull out, find about 50,000 startups in India. And when I say startups, these are predominantly technology startups, so to say. There are over 300 incubators. To the best of my knowledge, this is one of the highest number of incubators, in the world. There are almost an equal number, about 200 to 300 odd active investors in the country. And when I say investors, these are of course spread across the spectrum, which starts from, let's say, angel, seed, all the way to fairly advanced stages such as Series D, E, and so on. There are, and of course the number keeps going up and down, but some estimates point us at about 31 unicorns in amongst the startups. And unicorns would typically be startups whose valuation is more than $1 billion US dollars. So that's really, I mean, I use that metric to talk about the stage at which the startup ecosystem stands as of now. So this is what the ecosystem looks like as of now, with 50,000 startups, 31 unicorns, about 200 to 300 investors, 300 incubators, and really spread across the geography of India. If we were to now pause and take a few steps back to look at um, how has this ecosystem sort of evolved? What has happened in the history? What has happened in the past for us to be where we are today? And I believe that the first seeds of what we call the startup ecosystem could be traced back until about between 1960s and to 1980s. This is when the IT revolution, so to say, was just about beginning to find its presence in the Indian subcontinent and predominantly India. This is the time when nearly the first generation of engineers had traveled largely to the US markets and also to the European markets to work with technology companies there. And in their experience of being employed in these companies, realized this market asymmetries. They also realized, of course, a price arbitrage in terms of the talent available back at home, vis-a-vis the services, the price of the services, products being created in these developed economies. Simply put, they saw the opportunity. They saw the opportunity in setting up technology businesses back at home in India to be able to capitalize on the talent available and therefore create products and services for clients that were located in, let's say, the US or the European markets predominantly. This is when companies like Patni Systems or Infosys, these are the most common names, TCS for that matter. In fact, TCS came up a little earlier than 1980s, but these are the names that most commonly are talked about now. And these were the companies that I believe laid the foundation of what we can see as technology entrepreneurship in the country. So this was really the first phase. This was also one of the biggest impactful phases of the evolution, because creating of these companies instituted a pull for more engineers in the country, and which is where we saw more college, more sort of school graduates heading towards engineering education, because there was promise for better and there was promise of better and well-paid employment at their graduation as engineers. This moved on to sometime around early 1990s until about early 2000s, which is where we find almost an explosion in the startups, and most of these startups were essentially building consumer-focused products. This is also coinciding with the time when the Indian economy opened up around 1991 or so, and therefore we find that people had more income available in their hands because most of them were employed in IT companies, which were perhaps better paymasters than other local smaller organizations. And therefore more money available in the hands of a typical Indian middle class. The desire to spend for a better life, of course, was higher, and therefore there was a market to create consumer products, and which is where we see this explosion in the startup ecosystem, particularly characterized by startups building consumer products. If you look at the unicorns today, most of them are consumer-focused startups. Most of them have set up business in 2000s and serving the consumers directly. The stage that we are in is what I would characterize as a deep tech, innovation heavy phase in startups in the country. This is also the phase where we are seeing innovation in technologies which are beyond, let's say, the IT, so to say, bracket that characterized the Indian ecosystem about a few decades ago. We also find startups that are born international now, and they aren't essentially designed to serve the Indian markets first and then therefore look at international markets. We also find innovation in areas that have remained away from startups focus. And some of these are, let's say, areas such as civic technologies or space technologies, or even difficult areas such as agri-technologies. So this is sort of the history, starting with an IT revolution, going on to a large consumer-focused market, and then deep innovation, deep technologies being the focus of startups. And this is where we are as an ecosystem. If I were to just take about half a minute more to talk about what is the overlap that we see with higher education, and in fact, I pulled some statistics. We look at the Ministry of the Human Resource Development, talks about 1.6 million engineering graduates that came out of universities in 2019. And these are universities and schools that rank across. There are, of course, about 50 to 60 institutes of eminence, and I'm only talking about engineering schools. These, of course, include institutes of Indian Institutes of Technology, roughly about 20 to 30 Indian Institutes of Technology. There are institutes of information technology, and then there are national institutes of technology. And then there are universities that are offering engineering courses. All of these put together roughly graduated about 1.5 million engineers in 2019. If we also were to just pull out and look at the Indian Institutes of Technologies, which are the most eminent schools of technology in the country, these are also the most prolific beds of entrepreneurship in the country. Some of the leading entrepreneurship centers, such as SINE in IIT Bombay, such as FITT in IIT Delhi, or the Research Park in IIT Madras, or the Entrepreneurship Center at IISc. These have been and continue to be the most promising and the most impactful beds of where we find most driven and sort of well-talented founders coming out from. So this is essentially what the Indian startup ecosystem looks like right now, particularly keeping in mind or just touching upon the higher education, engineering higher education in the country. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you, Supriya. These are very impressive numbers, because just 1.5 million engineers in the country, it means that there is an incredible driver for innovation, technology, etc. And you also told us that there are 300 incubators, a lot of centers for entrepreneurship. So it is, as expected, a very lively innovation ecosystem or entrepreneurship ecosystem. So in this situation, could you tell us more about the role of these intermediate institutions, incubators and TTOs in the system, and the way in which these are assessed, measured, and if possible, financed or supported somehow? Thank you, Supriya.
Thanks, Rafael. Great question. This is also something that that I keep wondering about largely, and maybe let me organize my response in three parts. One, of course, and to quickly touch upon what is this incubation ecosystem in the country? How does it look like? I just mentioned that there were about 300 incubators, more than 300 incubators that we find in India. And these are, of course, spread across the geography of India. While we find the southern and the western part of India more loaded with more number of incubators, more density of incubators, but we also find incubators in difficult to reach geographies in the northeast, or perhaps in the extreme north. But that aside, about 80% of at least about 80% of these incubators are located within education institutions, and particularly higher education institutions. These, of course, would include both engineering schools as well as non-engineering schools like the Indian Institutes of Management. If we were to look at, and of course, so who are the remaining 20%? The 20% are incubators that are either set up by industry bodies, such as, let's say, NASCOM, or research bodies which focus on deep technology research, do not have an affiliating academic institution, but essentially these incubators just focus on developing technologies and then taking them to a commercialization route. But if we were to now come back, so this is in a way, this is the spread of incubators in the country. But if we were to look at the academic institution-based incubators, so far, because most of these incubators have been based in engineering schools, the natural approach that they have taken to incubation is commercialization of technology. The default way in which they have approached incubation has been, and this is also true for a large part of the world, incubators were seen, traditionally were seen as technology transfer offices. And when you have a history like that, your view of incubation also becomes sort of guided by that history. So far, and if you were to now juxtapose this with the incubation policies predominantly, and we've looked at some policies of the central government, the government of India, we find most incubation support policies also talk about incubators as platforms for commercialization of technology, which is developed in the host institution. The question that we should ask is, that while that may be a valid way to conceptualize or visualize an incubator, but is that the only way? The way, and particularly keeping in mind how the ecosystem has evolved, where it stands right now, incubators aren't just platforms for this commercialization to happen. Founders aren't just sort of found within academic institutions. If we look at the profile of founders in India, they are, of course, a large part of them are people who have been working in the industry for several years and then decided to set up their ventures, and then decided to develop a product that would solve a problem. And therefore, and when they would need incubation, they aren't really looking for commercialization of their research or a piece of technology that they would have developed. And therefore, incubators need to adopt another role to be relevant for this category of founders who aren't present, who aren't really just graduates of engineering schools. The point that I'm making is that incubators, of course, their role, the expectations from them has become wider, has grown beyond just being platforms that would commercialize, that would aid commercialization of technology. I'm sorry for the cheesiness, but the metric that I use to describe how do you measure what an incubator does is something that I call E3O. Incubators essentially focus or build 3 E's and 1 O. The first E is incubators build entrepreneurs, and which is where incubators undertake capacity development programs. Incubators build enterprises, which is where this whole piece of commercialization of technology, of product creation, of business support services, these sort of feature. Incubators also build ecosystems, which is where we are talking about building networks, building communities, which would learn from each other, which would sort of lead to a more flourishing community, more flourishing ecosystem. And then finally, the O, incubators must also build themselves as organizations. The O often gets left out when we talk about incubators, so to say. And which is why to maybe summarize my answer to the question that you asked, Rafael. Incubators aren't just platforms that commercialize technology. They build entrepreneurs, they build enterprises, they build ecosystems, and they build themselves as organizations. Their measurement metrics, the metrics of the measures of how well they have performed must be aligned to their goals, whether they're building entrepreneurs, whether they're predominantly building enterprises, or they're building ecosystems. And that is the nuance that we need in how we see incubators, particularly in the dynamic and fast evolving ecosystem of India.
Thank you very much, Supriya. A very interesting answer. Thank you very much for delivering the message that actually technology and technology transfer is important, but it's not the only way to incubate and actually develop innovations. So now the third question before moving to Q&A. Can we discuss a little bit about recent trends in the Indian innovation landscape? For instance, trends in education and also agriculture that are very important for the inclusive development of the country. Over to you, Supriya.
Thanks, Julia. Great question again. Also makes me ponder about how we were. I mean, as humans, as earthlings, we would have felt so good and so confident talking about trends earlier this year. But so many of our assumptions sort of have been thrown out of the window over the last 8 to 10 months or so. I hope that we are able to regain that confidence when we talk about the future and the trends. But I'll try to answer your question to the best of my ability and sort of the data that we could, that I could possibly touch upon. So talking about, okay. Maybe pausing here before I jump into education and agriculture, the two sectors that you talk about. COVID-19 has also been a time where the Indian government has announced several measures so as to be able to catalyze more economic activity in the country. And we'll touch upon this when I talk about perhaps agriculture in a few minutes. But maybe starting with education. COVID-19 has also been a catalyst for more education technologies to be offered as products and across the spectrum of K to 12 to higher education to even skill building for employment. In India, and this of course, there has been a large pull from the market to access more education technologies, more edtech products. And we find a lot of activity across this entire, so there are of course products that are available for infants, for young children, for adolescents. And these are essentially technologies that aid their learning. And learning, of course, not just limited to what they learn at school, but also development of cognitive abilities. Play Shifu is one of the companies that is taking a very fairly novel approach to how do you integrate play and sort of development of cognitive abilities. If we were to look at a slightly advanced stage, which is when students in India typically take on preparing for competitive examinations, or preparing for their end of school examinations, which is where we have some amazing companies such as Topper, who are doing phenomenal work in providing inputs for students to prepare for these competitive examinations. All of these are, of course, are deep technology companies. And then if we were to talk about, let's say, skill building as or skill building for employment, there is a whole host of companies, and one of them that comes to my mind is Springboard. That is developed, that Springboard, in fact, even Upgrad, that has developed courses in in relevant skills such as data science or product design, so to say. What is also very interesting, particularly in the Indian edtech space, is creation of technologies that help a large part of the Indian population surpass the barrier that they would often find in their working knowledge of English. A large part of Indian students do not go through English medium schools. Therefore, their struggles to grasp a subject, to understand a subject are way high when they get into engineering school. So they may graduate as engineers, but their conceptual understanding may not be as best because they're not used to absorbing information in a non-native language, which is English. We find some fantastic companies that are helping young graduates surpass this barrier of English knowledge. The two companies that come to my mind are Goovi, which is trying to break down engineering courses from English to native Indian languages. And they've done fantastic work. They're a fairly new company. They've done fantastic work. There's also companies like Blackboard Radio who are trying to take the stress away from not knowing English, particularly for young graduates or students that are just graduating out of schools. So this is largely what we see in the edtech space, the kind of startups that we see in the edtech space. COVID-19 virtual world, of course, are unleashing a whole host of opportunities for these startups. It is also, I think, democratizing access to education, access to learning for the entire nation. So that's at least my view on the side of edtech. On the side of agriculture technologies, and this is where I want to touch upon some of the recent initiatives that the government of India has taken. It has passed 3 farm acts, which override some of the longest standing practices in the Indian agriculture ecosystem. There's very active debate in the country about whether these acts are needed, whether they are helpful, whether they aren't helpful. But that aside, agriculture technology is at least one space that I'm quite excited about. So far, we see startups working across this entire value chain of agriculture. We find startups that are using data to, and this is right in the beginning, to provide inputs to farmers on, and this is around, let's say, aspects such as precision farming. They're creating tools for farmers, and particularly smallholder farmers, to access more expensive resources better. There are, of course, startups that are creating farmers access to markets, and this is where, at least their goal, these startups aim at improving farmers' incomes. And then there are startups that are doing this entire piece, which is starting from farmers' access to credit. Companies such as Jai Kisan is doing some really fantastic work there. And then if you look at this entire chain, this also extends to to at least the consumer who is purchasing these food products. There are companies like Superzop or Udan who are connecting this entire agri-value chain to the small mom and pop stores who sell agriculture produce or who sell food produce. And therefore they're able to connect this entire sort of value chain and be able to deliver better value, better sort of price to the farmers, as well as more efficiency to the small enterprises. So this is at least where the agriculture value chain at least that's how it looks right now. I believe, and if we look at the number of, there would be about 400 to 450 odd agriculture technology startups in the country. We don't have, I don't think there is any one of them that is a unicorn yet. But there are two trends that we should be mindful of when we talk about agri-tech. One, of course, is the increase in consumers' ability to pay for specialized products. So which is, when I say specialized, these of course would be organic produce or more indigenous sort of grains, which would create more opportunities for startups that are creating directly or direct to consumer sort of models. The second trend that we must watch out for is aggregation of farmers, and these are of course called the format that is adopted in India is called the farmer producer organization. So farmer producer companies, which are a collective of farmers, and when startups interact with these collectives, they would be able to reduce the cost of distribution of their products, reduce the cost of accessing the produce from the farmers, because they deal with these collectives and not necessarily individual farmers that are spread all over. I think these two trends would unleash, would open up more opportunities for agri-tech in the country. I hope that answered your question, Julia.
Thank you very much, Supriya, especially these trends in the agriculture field for rural communities. I think it's really fascinating. And I see some parallelism of what I am observing in some Southeast Asian countries, Indonesia, Myanmar, and many more. So I think there's really an opportunity to make this sector completely, let's say, different and more innovative, bringing a lot of benefit to a lot of individuals in those communities. Perhaps Raffaele also want to comment. If not, we can move directly to Q&A. But Raffaele, anything you want to add?
No, it's I was thinking about the is evident that entrepreneurship is a way to make innovation available to people and users, and this is a little bit more evident in the discussion of Supriya. But it is amazing how many questions now I would have about the governance issues, and I see that there are also questions related to the multi-level governance of India. So I would move to the Q&A session immediately. So I give the floor to Anne.
Maria's going to kick us off with our first question.
Yes, thank you, Anne. Thank you very much, Supriya, for your insights. There was one question related to the investors. At the beginning of your presentation, you said there were 300 investors. Could you talk a bit more about who they are, if they're local, international, and what is their role in the startup ecosystem? How do they support startups specifically? Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Maria. And I believe the question is from Christos. Thanks, Christos, for the question. Of course, and finance is one of the most critical aspects or most critical needs of a startup. In India, we find investors that aren't just local. We find some of the leading investors, global investors, have set up their presence in India. So that's of course one sort of part of, or one group of investors that we find in India. The other group of investors that we find in India are a lot of local angels, which could be individuals, which could be ex-entrepreneurs, ex or even current entrepreneurs, which could be corporate leaders. In addition to individual angels, we also find angel networks or sort of collaborations or communities of angel investors jointly investing in startups. And these investments are at the early stages. At a slightly advanced stage, we find incubators making seed and pre-series A investments in startups as well. The funds for investments made by incubators predominantly come from various schemes of the central as well as state governments. Some part of this funding also comes from let's say multilateral agencies such as the various foundations that have an active presence in the country. And then the third piece, which is, so let's say angels, incubators, the third piece are local, not, and I think local is perhaps an understatement to describe the investors, but homegrown investors that have first set shop in India and focus particularly on the Indian startup ecosystem. And then there are the international investors that have also reached and set up base and a fairly, I think, prolific base in India. I hope that answers.
Thanks very much. So
Thanks.
I'm going to draw on from another question from the chat. This one's from Lucia, where she was asking about the startup ecosystems in India, and wondering whether there are some sort of common enabling framework conditions that have allowed the startup ecosystem to flourish, and also if there are any regional differences that would be useful to highlight, where certain regions have had more success than others because of different policies they've pursued.
Okay, thanks, Anne. Thanks, Lucia. Great question again. So if I understand this correctly, you're saying that whether the startup ecosystems, and if you were to look at smaller regional ecosystems, whether they are replicable. If that is the question, to some extent, I would say yes, but like a classic MBA answer, it depends. It depends on a whole host of factors, which would of course include policy, particularly by the state government as well as national government. It would depend on the availability of talent. It would depend on the availability of other resources that an early stage startup would need to access. One of the most talked about region or regional startup ecosystem, it's no longer regional, is this city called Bangalore or Bengaluru, which often gets mentioned as one of the startup capitals of the world. Bangalore is great because it was also one of the, and if you remember, I spoke about this period of 1950s to 1980s when a lot of IT, not a lot of, but one of the foundations of IT businesses in India were laid. They were laid in Bangalore. So it has had a history of setting up technology businesses. Therefore, it also attracted more talent moving to the city. This also led to a creation of more engineering schools and higher education institutions, which meant that there would be fresh talent available in the region. The state government has also been quite supportive in terms of policies which would benefit startups and small businesses and incubators as well. So therefore, Bangalore has become this flourishing ecosystem. Is a Bangalore replicable entirely? I'm not quite sure, because while the other conditions, you could still replicate them. You could have great policy, you could bring in talent, you could bring in other resources, but how do you turn back time? So what may have worked about 20 years ago for a Bangalore may not work for, let's say, Agartala, which is in the Northeast, in 2020. There would need to be a fresh set of conditions that would need for Agartala to be established as an equally flourishing ecosystem. So that's at least the first part of your question. The second part, of course, and are about common enabling framework conditions, and are there any specificities in some regions that have determined greater success? I just mentioned some of the specificities that you find in a Bangalore. But I also believe, and this is where at least some of the changes that we are seeing in the Indian ecosystem are around a regionalization of startups. We find, in fact, one of our arms works in Rajasthan, the state that Rafael was mentioning a little while ago, and they are working on building startups that are evangelizing Indian crafts. So they're applying technology to crafts as a sector, so arts and crafts as a sector, because Rajasthan has been known to be the bed of Indian crafts and largely various forms of crafts, and therefore that becomes a natural base for startups that are trying to evangelize that sort of sector to be located out of Rajasthan or Jaipur. You can't really replicate, it would be unfair to replicate the same sector focus in, let's say, Coimbatore, which is focused more on textiles, because a craft startup would find themselves almost like a fish out of water. And therefore, those sort of regional differences must be used or must be built upon to be able to, for us to be able to set up more flourishing ecosystems that are contextually relevant. I hope that answered.
Thank you so much. If you get, another question that we have, we talked extensively about the incubator system in India, also mentioning that 80% of incubators are located within higher education institutions. And we're just wondering, what are your concerns for the impact of COVID on this and going forward as well?
Several concerns, but many of them have been addressed at least in the last 5 months or so. Incubators typically have been, or traditionally have been known to be physical bodies, or have been known to have physical infrastructure that startups would be able to access and therefore grow further. What I find to be happening over the last few months is a quick move that several incubators have moved from physical infrastructure to virtual infrastructure. So while mentoring, coaching, even training programs were traditionally available in person within these incubator premises, they have moved to more virtual, they have taken a more virtual form in the last few months. So there has been some agility that several incubators have displayed, particularly in times of COVID, and for them to remain relevant in these changing times. But that said, I still believe that there's a lot that we need to catch up on. Moving from physical to virtual is just one piece of what COVID has thrown at us. There would have to be some rethinking in terms of what kind of inputs do startups need at this point in time. What kind of startups do you want to support further? At what stage, until what stage do you want to continue supporting startups? And some of these are some of the questions that incubators would need to deliberate on for them to remain relevant, for them to continue to deliver on their mandate, their goals, even in these difficult times.
Thank you. I think it's been fascinating. We've been all kind of frantically taking notes and absorbing everything. So thanks for your time. And I think we've kind of run out of time a bit. So I'm going to sort of pass over, although I see, sorry, does Robert have his hand raised? Do you want to come in with just a quick last question, Robert?
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks very much for the super interesting presentation. I just have one question that came to my mind. I remember a study among Indian engineering schools that had signaled that a lack of social and communication skills among graduates has been a big issue like some years ago. And you mentioned that these incubators, they're also engaging in like capacity building. Is like is this a big part of the capacity building, like trying to improve like language and communication skills and like managing skills among these graduates? Thanks a lot.
Absolutely, thanks, Robert. So of course, so those numbers I think still remain. I also was looking at a study that was done in 2018 or 2018, which talked about the employability of engineering graduates, and they actually touched upon these managerial and communication skills. Incubators, for sure, and many of them that I know do have programs on managerial or building managerial ability of young founders. And when I say managerial ability, they of course spread across the entire spectrum of what we call management. This could be marketing, this could be sales, this could be finance, so to say, right? So of course, those inputs are offered by incubators as part of their capacity building workshop. There are fewer incubators that, at least this is based on what I know of them, fewer incubators that have focused inputs on communication skills. A large part of the communication skills and training on large part of communication skills is around how do you pitch to investors. So there are some really fantastic programs that incubators and other agencies run, particularly for first-time founders to be able to craft impactful pitches, because that's really a make or break situation that early stage founders find themselves in. And therefore there are programs for them to improve on their communication so as to be able to make a positive dent with the investors that they are pitching to. So sure, and in that there are of course inputs that incubators provide both in terms of managerial skills and communication skills to young founders.
I don't know if Julia wants to add anything.
Later, go ahead.
Before we. No, thank you very much. Namaste, Supriya. It was fantastic to listen to you. It is everything you said is very interesting. Also the reflection about the system, the 3EO system, and this idea of the importance of the institutionalization of incubators and their relationship with ecosystems. What I my takeaway of this discussion is that probably in this webinar was better assessed the link between incubators, entrepreneurship, and then development services, well-being of people, sustainability. So it's incubators as a way to mobilize. I will not quote Omoto Sen in this interaction, but it is this idea that entrepreneurship is about mobilizing resources, also specific resources, thinking about in a smart way about the framework conditions, the potential, with this T variable in the background, and you face all the lock-in dynamics. Bangalore would not be replicable, the Silicon Valley would not be replicable, the industrial districts in Italy would not be replicable, but we still need these agglomeration dynamics. We'll still need entrepreneurship to be a driver of sustainable and inclusive growth. So thank you again for having spent almost 1 hour with us. It was a pleasure meeting you in virtual mode. I hope there will be soon the possibility to shake hands and see you in person. Thank you very much, Supriya.
Okay. Thank you, Supriya. Just a few words, Raffaele has already said it all, but because we are here to talk also about geography, thank you for this virtual journey across the Indian startup ecosystem from ICT in Bangalore to crafts in Jaipur.